My name is James Hartman. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Chicago, with my wife, Catherine, by my side. We've been married for 10 years now. On the surface, our life together seemed perfect. We owned a house, had decent jobs, and an enviable social life. But behind that facade, things were starting to unravel. I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it started, but over the last year, Catherine had become more distant. She still smiled at me during dinner, kissed me goodnight, and went through the motions like everything was fine. But I could see it in her eyes, the flicker of something hidden, something I couldn't reach. It was as though she was drifting further and further away, and no matter how much I tried to close the gap, the distance only grew. I began noticing the little things. She stayed late at work more often, and when she came home, she seemed tired, distracted. Her phone was always within reach, and she would answer messages with a nervous glance. I didn't want to be the kind of husband who snooped, but there were moments when I couldn't help it. One evening, as she was in the bathroom, I grabbed her phone from the counter. I wasn't planning on snooping, but something made me do it. There was a message waiting on her screen. It was from her colleague, Michael Sanders. The name alone made my stomach churn. They had worked together for years, but Michael was different. He had always been charming, with that easy smile that made women feel special. But Catherine? She was different with him, too. The message was simple enough. Looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. I miss you. I tried to brush it off as harmless work banter, but my gut told me something was off. This was no ordinary message. The words were intimate, and the way she responded, it sent a chill down my spine. My hand trembled as I set the phone back down, heart racing. Was I overreacting? Or was there more to this than I was willing to admit? The next few days felt like a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about that message. Every time I looked at Catherine, I saw something different. The way she would quickly glance at her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. The way she always seemed to be too busy to have a conversation with me. I knew something wasn't right. Couldn't sleep that night. I kept replaying the message in my head, wondering if I was imagining things or if I was starting to see something that had always been there. The thought of confronting her terrified me. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in my chest. I had to know the truth. So, I did something I never thought I would. I followed her the next evening. Catherine had been working late again, and this time, I decided to drive by her office after she told me she'd be there for a couple of hours. I parked a block away, hidden in the shadows of the parking garage. The minutes dragged on as I waited, anxiety building in the pit of my stomach. Then I saw her leave the building. She wasn't alone. She was walking with Michael. They were laughing, sharing a joke, and there was something about the way they looked at each other that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just two colleagues having a friendly conversation. No, this was something else. There was a chemistry between them, something I didn't have with her anymore. They got into Michael's car. I felt my chest tighten as I watched them drive off into the night, and for the first time in our marriage, I felt completely alone. The next morning, I didn't say a word to Catherine as we sat down for breakfast. I couldn't bring myself to look her in the eye. She seemed unusually calm, but I knew she could feel the tension in the air. After a few minutes of silence, she finally spoke. "James, what's wrong? You've been distant lately." I could feel the anger rising inside me, but I knew I had to stay composed. The truth had to come out. I couldn't keep pretending everything was okay when I knew it wasn't. "I saw you last night," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "With Michael." Her face went pale. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it. But then, she just sighed and looked down at her plate. "James, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "It was a mistake. A stupid mistake." I felt a lump form in my throat, but I didn't want to cry in front of her. I had to know more. "Tell me everything," I said, my voice hardening. "How long has this been going on?" Catherine's hands shook as she set down her fork. "It started a few months ago. We were working late together, and one thing led to another. I never meant for it to happen, but it did. And it wasn't just one time. We've been seeing each other. She looked up at me then, and there was a look of guilt in her eyes, but also something else, something that hurt even more. I never meant to hurt you, James. I don't know. I was confused and he was there. I never stopped loving you, but I couldn't hear anymore. The words she was saying didn't matter anymore. The betrayal was too deep. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this, I whispered, trying to hold back the tears. I don't know who you are anymore. And with that, I walked out. We didn't speak for days. The silence between Catherine and me was deafening. It was as if we had both stepped into different worlds, where the bond we once shared no longer existed. She kept pretending everything was fine, but I saw right through it. I couldn't just let it go, though. I couldn't pretend that I wasn't bleeding inside. The more I thought about her betrayal, the more I realized that I couldn't let her off easy. I needed her to feel the same gut-wrenching pain I had felt when I first discovered the truth. In those sleepless nights, my anger was burning, but it was more than just anger. It was a cold, calculated determination to make her regret her actions. I wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed. Not after everything. The plan started to form piece by piece. Catherine had always prided herself on her career. It was her everything, the thing she worked so hard for. She had climbed the corporate ladder in a prestigious marketing company and had built a reputation for herself. Her identity was tied to that job. It was everything. And I knew that if there was anything that could break her, it was to take that away. I started thinking about the connections I had. I knew people, and I knew how to use them. My first target was Michael. He might have thought he was untouchable, but I knew his weaknesses. He was reckless with his success, always flaunting it. And Catherine? She was just as careless. She thought no one would ever suspect the affair. I would make sure she knew that secrets have a way of coming to light. Using my own resources, I began digging. I found the cracks in their professional relationship. They were too close for comfort, and I knew that if I pushed the right buttons, it would all come crashing down. I started small, subtle hints, little manipulations. An anonymous tip here, a well-timed rumor there. I sent emails and made phone calls that I knew would raise questions. One day, I anonymously submitted a complaint to the company's HR department, outlining their inappropriate relationship. I described how Catherine and Michael had crossed professional boundaries and how their actions were affecting their colleagues. I made sure the letter seemed legitimate, something no one would be able to dismiss. Catherine was the first to feel the heat. It was only a matter of time before the company started investigating. She didn't know who had done it. She didn't know where the leak had come from, but she felt the walls closing in on her. I could see it in her eyes as the stress of the situation took hold. The once confident woman, who had been so secure in her career, was starting to crack. And I wasn't done yet. The days after I sent the anonymous tip felt like a slow-motion countdown. Catherine began to unravel in front of me. She started taking phone calls in private, pacing the house when she thought I wasn't watching, and obsessively checking her phone. The weight of the investigation at work was starting to show. She was becoming increasingly paranoid. But what she didn't know was that I had already sealed her fate. I could almost hear her thoughts racing as she tried to piece together who would want to destroy her career. She had no idea that it was me, the man she had betrayed, the one she thought would just move on quietly. I could tell that she was starting to question her own actions, wondering if she had made a mistake by getting so close to Michael. The irony of it all wasn't lost on me. She had no clue that the very thing she was trying to protect was slipping through her fingers. And it was all because of me. One evening, as she sat across from me at dinner, her hands trembling as she tried to hold her fork, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. She was clearly distressed, but I didn't care. She deserved this. James, I don't know what's happening at work. There's an investigation. They're asking about Michael and me. Her voice faltered. I didn't do anything wrong, I swear. I don't know who's spreading these lies. I stared at her, feeling a knot tighten in my chest. I could have told her the truth then, could have told her that I was the one who had orchestrated this. But I didn't. Instead, I let her continue to spiral, watching as she fought to keep control of everything she had built. You don't know who could be doing this? I asked, My voice steady but with an edge of mockery. No idea at all? Her eyes darted to mine, and for a brief moment, I saw something flicker in them. Something almost like fear. But she quickly masked it with a forced smile. You don't believe me, do you? I leaned back in my chair, pretending to be indifferent, but on the inside, I was reveling in the power I had over her. It's hard to believe anything when everything falls apart. She stood up suddenly, her chair scraping across the floor. I'm going to fix this, James. I swear I will. Just give me time. But I could tell by the way her voice cracked that she wasn't as confident as she tried to appear. She was already on the edge, and all it would take was one final push to send her tumbling into the abyss. That night I didn't sleep. Couldn't. I watched as Catherine tossed and turned in bed, her mind racing, trying to figure out how to salvage what she had lost. But she was missing something crucial. She had no control anymore. The game had shifted, and now I held all the cards. Days passed, and Catherine's stress was becoming more visible. She started avoiding me more often, spending her evenings locked away in her office, obsessively working on damage control. It was clear that the investigation at work was getting more intense. Every time she picked up the phone, her voice would tremble with uncertainty. She was losing her grip on everything she had worked so hard for. And I, watching from the sidelines, knew I had to push her just a little further. It was a Saturday morning when the call came. Catherine had stepped out of the house to get some coffee, and I found myself alone, sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the television. The phone rang, its shrill sound cutting through the silence. I didn't recognize the number, but something told me it was important. I picked it up, my heart pounding as I heard a familiar voice on the other end. Mr. Hartman? This is Caroline from HR. We need to discuss an urgent matter regarding your wife. I sat up straighter, suddenly feeling the gravity of the situation. What's going on? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. We've conducted a thorough investigation, and we have found some discrepancies in the reports submitted by Mrs. Hartman and Mr. Sanders, Caroline explained. We're calling both of them in for a meeting tomorrow. It's likely that this will affect their positions within the company. If you'd like, you can attend as well, though it's not mandatory. I could hear the words, but they didn't quite register. The satisfaction of hearing that Catherine's career was hanging by a thread was overwhelming. I had set everything in motion, and now it was coming to fruition. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. I'll be there, I said, my voice cold. I'll make sure Catherine knows what's coming. After the call ended, I felt a strange calm wash over me. This was the moment, the tipping point. Tomorrow everything would change. I didn't know if Catherine fully understood what was at stake, but I was about to make sure she did. When she returned home that afternoon, I didn't say a word. I knew she would bring up the investigation. I could see it written on her face. She opened the door, her eyes scanning the room nervously, and I could tell she was on edge. James, you won't believe what just happened, she began, dropping her bag onto the couch. They want me to go into a meeting tomorrow. Caroline from HR called. I didn't respond immediately. I simply watched her as she tried to compose herself. She was doing her best to act calm, but I saw the cracks beneath her facade. I know, I finally said, my voice low. I got the call too. Her eyes widened. You did? What did they say? I let the silence hang in the air for a moment, letting her anxiety build before I spoke. They said there's a chance you might lose your job. They're investigating everything. The panic on her face was immediate. She reached out for my hand, but I pulled it away before she could touch me. She wasn't getting the comfort she wanted. Not this time. James, please. Her voice cracked as she pleaded with me, but I could see it. She was scared. The woman who had betrayed me, who had destroyed everything we had, was finally beginning to realize the cost of her actions. You should have thought about that before you decided to destroy our marriage, I said, my words cold and sharp. The air between us thickened. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She just stood there, frozen, staring at me as if she were seeing me for the first time. I wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning. That night, As she lay in bed next to me, I could feel her heart pounding against her chest. But I knew it was no longer for me. It was for her career, her reputation. Her life as she knew it was slipping away, and I was the one making it happen. The day of the meeting arrived, and I couldn't help but feel a certain satisfaction watching Catherine's anxiety grow with every passing minute. She had dressed up in her usual professional attire, trying to appear calm and collected, but I could see the sweat on her brow and the nervous flicks of her eyes. She knew, deep down, that her life was about to fall apart, and no matter how much she tried to deny it, she wasn't in control anymore. We drove to the company's headquarters in silence. The weight of what was coming hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Catherine kept glancing at me, as if hoping for reassurance, but I gave her nothing. I was done reassuring her. This was about her reckoning, and she would face it alone. When we arrived, Catherine immediately walked into the building, her steps hesitant but determined. I followed her inside, my heart pounding, but it wasn't from anxiety. It was from anticipation. I was going to watch everything she had worked so hard for crumble right before her eyes. We were escorted to a small conference room, where Caroline from HR was already waiting. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman, and I could tell that she was just as focused on the upcoming meeting as I was. There was no warmth in her smile as she welcomed us inside. "Mr. and Mrs. Hartman, please take a seat," Caroline said. Her tone was professional, but I could sense a certain tension in her voice. The situation was serious. Catherine sat down first, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her blazer. I took the seat beside her, feeling a strange sense of detachment as I watched her try to hold herself together. Her usual confidence was nowhere to be found. The woman who had once seemed untouchable was now just a shadow of her former self. Caroline wasted no time in getting to the point. "We've conducted an internal investigation into the complaints we've received regarding the relationship between you, Mrs. Hartman, and Mr. Sanders. As you know, any involvement that crosses the professional boundary is a serious violation of company policy." I watched Catherine closely as Caroline spoke, her face pale, her lips pressed together in a tight line. I could see the panic in her eyes now. It was all coming to an end, and she knew it. "I didn't do anything wrong," Catherine interjected, her voice shaky but defiant. "Yes, Michael and I are close, but it's not what you think. We're just colleagues, nothing more." Caroline raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Hartman, we have email correspondence, text messages, and witness statements that suggest otherwise. This situation is more complicated than just a few friendly conversations." I could see the color drain from Catherine's face as the evidence was laid out before her. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She couldn't deny it. She couldn't explain away what was happening. Her affair with Michael had become public knowledge, and now it was costing her everything. Caroline turned to me, her gaze piercing. "Mr. Hartman, would you like to say anything?" I looked at Catherine, who was sitting there in stunned silence, her hands wringing in her lap. She was defeated. I could feel the satisfaction building inside me, but I kept my face neutral. "I have nothing to say," I replied quietly. "Catherine knows what's at stake here." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of the conversation pressing down on all of us. Caroline cleared her throat. "We will conduct a final review of the situation and make a decision about Mrs. Hartman's future with the company. You will be notified of the results shortly." Catherine stood up quickly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Wait, no, this can't be happening. I worked so hard for this job. I didn't even need to hear the rest of her sentence. She was pleading, but I wasn't moved. I had already made my decision. Catherine had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. As we left the meeting, the air between us felt colder than it ever had before. Catherine didn't speak to me on the drive back. Her eyes were glazed over, and I could tell she was lost in her own thoughts. But I knew one thing for sure. I had made her pay, and she was going to remember this for the rest of her life. The next few days were a blur of uncertainty for Catherine. I could see her trying to hold it together, but every time she walked into a room, the weight of what was happening at work hung heavily on her. The company hadn't made its final decision yet, but the rumors and whispers had already begun. The damage had been done. She was no longer the confident, successful woman she had once been. Now, she was a person on the edge, teetering between denial and reality. At home, she was distant. She spent long hours on the phone, speaking with her colleagues, trying to salvage whatever she could. But I knew it was a losing battle. Every time she hung up, her face would drop, the mask slipping just a little more. She no longer knew how to deal with the consequences of her actions, and it was obvious that it was eating her alive. It was late one evening when she finally confronted me. I had been sitting in the living room, flipping through some papers when she entered. Her eyes were red from crying, her face pale and drawn. She stood in the doorway for a moment, as if trying to gather her thoughts before she spoke. "James," she began, her voice quieter than usual. "I've been thinking about everything. About us. About what I've done." She took a deep breath, but the words seemed to get stuck in her throat. "I never meant for things to turn out this way. I cut her off before she could continue, my voice sharp. "You never meant for things to turn out this way? You didn't think about me at all, did you? All you cared about was your career, your ambition. You didn't care about the damage you were doing, not just to me, but to everything we built together." She flinched at my words, but I didn't stop. I needed her to understand the depth of her betrayal. I needed her to feel it. "I tried to fix things, James," she said, her voice breaking. "I tried to make it right. I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you." Her apologies meant nothing to me now. They were empty, just like her promises. "You don't get to fix anything. What you did can't be fixed." Catherine stepped closer, her hands trembling as she reached for mine. "Please, James. I love you. I made a mistake. I was weak, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make it up to you. Please don't throw everything away." I could feel the desperation in her touch, the raw emotion in her words. But all I could think about was how far gone we were. There was no going back from this. She had crossed a line that I could never unsee, and even if she had the best intentions now, it didn't change what had happened. "I'm not going to forgive you, Catherine," I said, my voice steady. "I've made my peace with it. I won't let you destroy me any longer." She stood there for a long moment, her eyes searching mine, as if hoping I'd change my mind. But I didn't. She had already made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. The next few days brought more bad news for her. The company informed her that they had completed the investigation, and the result was just as I had predicted. Catherine was fired. They cited the inappropriate relationship with a colleague as grounds for her termination. I didn't feel bad for her. I didn't feel sorry for the woman who had once been my partner, my wife. The woman who had destroyed everything for the sake of her own ambition. The one who had betrayed me in the worst possible way. Now, as she stood in front of me, with nothing left but her pride, I knew there was nothing more to say. She had learned a painful lesson, but it was too late for redemption. She was broken, and it was because of her own choices. The days after Catherine's termination were filled with an eerie stillness. The woman who had once been so full of life and ambition now moved around the house like a ghost. She barely left her room, and when she did, her eyes seemed distant, as if she were searching for something, anything, to hold on to. I watched her, but I didn't speak. What could I say? There was nothing left to say. Her career was gone, her reputation tarnished, and the one thing she had held dear, her sense of control, was slipping further and further away. The person who had betrayed me was no longer the woman I had once loved. She was a shadow of her former self. For the first time, I felt something that wasn't just anger or vengeance. It was indifference. I had gotten my revenge, but now it felt hollow. Watching her fall apart in front of me didn't bring me the satisfaction I had expected. Instead, it just made me feel empty. One evening, after another long, silent dinner, Catherine finally spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, as though she were afraid of the answer I might give. "James, I don't know what to do anymore," she said, her voice breaking. "I've lost everything. My job, my dignity, my pride, and I can't fix it. I don't know how to fix any of it. I looked at her, feeling nothing but a cold emptiness. She had made her bed. She had made the choices that led her here. I had only played my part in making sure she understood the cost of those choices. You can't fix it, Catherine, I replied, my voice flat. There's nothing left to fix. You chose this path. You chose your career, your lies, your betrayal. Now you have to deal with the consequences. She looked at me, the tears welling up in her eyes, but I didn't feel a flicker of sympathy. I didn't care anymore. She had taken everything from me. My trust, my love, my sense of security, and I wasn't about to let her take any more. I thought you'd want me to fix it, she whispered, as if speaking to herself more than to me. I shook my head. There's nothing to fix. You're not the woman I married anymore. You've destroyed everything, and I'm done. Catherine collapsed onto the couch, her face in her hands, her sobs filling the room. But I didn't move to comfort her. Couldn't. This was the price she had to pay, and I wasn't going to let her off easy. The week dragged on after Catherine's emotional breakdown. Every time I passed her in the house, I could feel the tension between us. The silence was suffocating, but neither of us dared to break it. I didn't know what I expected from her, but I knew she wouldn't offer any kind of reconciliation. She had already made her choices, and now she was paying the price. I had started to feel a strange sense of detachment. It wasn't anger anymore. The anger had faded, replaced by something far colder. Indifference. The woman who had once been my everything, the woman who had held my trust and love, was now a stranger. I felt nothing for her. I could see the guilt in her eyes, but even that didn't move me. I didn't even feel any joy when the inevitable day came. I didn't have to ask her if she was leaving. Everything about her demeanor, from the way she moved to the way she avoided looking me in the eyes, told me that she was preparing to go. It was late in the evening when I came home, walking through the front door to find the house eerily quiet. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound that filled the silence. But when I stepped into the living room, I saw her. Catherine stood in the doorway of our bedroom, suitcase in hand. She looked different, smaller, fragile almost. Her makeup was smudged, and her eyes were puffy from crying. But there was no anger in her face, no pride, just resignation. I'm going, she said softly, as if the words were both final and heartbreaking. I stopped in my tracks, not knowing how to respond. It wasn't that I didn't expect this moment. It was more that, for the first time, I didn't feel anything. She was leaving, and I should have felt a sense of victory. I should have felt like I had won. But I didn't. Okay, I said quietly, letting my words settle between us. It was almost as if I were talking to a stranger. I wasn't speaking to the woman I had once shared a life with. I was speaking to someone I had no emotional ties to anymore. Catherine looked down at the suitcase in her hands, as if she needed a moment to compose herself before speaking again. Her voice cracked as she whispered, I don't have a choice anymore, do I? The question hung in the air, unspoken for a moment, but I didn't give her the comfort of an answer. What was there to say? She had made her choice, and there was nothing left to salvage. The pieces of us that were worth saving had long been scattered, and there was no picking them up now. She took a hesitant step towards me, her eyes searching mine, perhaps for some sign of softness, of forgiveness, but I gave her nothing. I simply stood there, still waiting. I'll leave the keys on the counter, she said in a hollow tone, as if she were trying to fill the emptiness with actions rather than words. I'm sorry, James. I'm so sorry for everything. I didn't mean for it to get this far. I didn't mean to hurt you. She was apologizing, and yet the words felt so empty to me. She was sorry, but that didn't change anything. I didn't need her apologies anymore. I didn't need her at all. I glanced at the keys she placed on the counter in the kitchen, the final symbol of our broken relationship, and said, Goodbye, Catherine. My voice was steady, final. There was no malice in it, no bitterness. Just the truth. She had left, and in her leaving, she had already severed the last thread between us. She turned away from me, unable to speak another word. I watched as she walked out of the house, the door clicking softly behind her. I couldn't tell if she was relieved or heartbroken. It didn't matter. What mattered was that she was gone, and I had no intention of chasing her. Days passed since Catherine left, and the house felt like an empty shell. The air seemed thicker, filled with the memories of everything that had been shattered between us. I moved around the house, trying to get used to the silence, but there was a heaviness that lingered in the corners of every room. Her presence, or what was left of it, was everywhere. The remnants of her life here were scattered about. Clothes in the laundry, photographs on the walls, a faint scent of perfume still clinging to the sheets in our bedroom. But as I stood in the middle of our home, I felt nothing. Nothing but a deep, gnawing emptiness. Catherine had gone, and I had gotten what I wanted. She had lost everything. Her job, her career, and, most of all, her sense of self. She had paid the price for her betrayal, and in doing so, I had made her regret every decision she had ever made. I had broken her. I had won. But the victory felt hollow. I had thought that breaking her would heal me, that watching her crumble would somehow fill the hole she had left in my heart. I had imagined that once she was gone, I would feel the rush of triumph, the sense of justice being served. But there was nothing, no sense of relief, no satisfaction. Instead, I found myself standing in an empty house, staring at the remnants of a life that had once meant everything to me. I realized then that the destruction of everything we had wasn't as sweet as I had expected. It had been a battle I thought would bring me peace, but in the end, it had only left me more broken than before. I moved through the house, picking up random things. Her perfume bottle on the dresser, an old book she had left on the kitchen counter, a framed picture of us from happier times. But each item felt like a reminder of something I had lost, something I would never get back. The house was quiet, too quiet, and for the first time, I wished it were filled with the chaos we had once had. But it was too late for regrets. I had watched her walk away, and in doing so, I had let go of the part of me that still cared. I had made her pay, and now I was left with nothing but the emptiness of victory. I had won the battle, but the war had already taken its toll on me. If you've been following my journey, you might be wondering, was it worth it? Was the price of revenge ever truly worth paying? If you've been captivated by this story, stay with me. There's so much more to explore. In the world of love, betrayal, and redemption, things are rarely as they seem. If you want to learn what happens next or dive deeper into my story, don't forget to subscribe and keep following my path. There's always more to uncover, and the journey is far from over. Subscribe now, and stay tuned for more twists, turns, and revelations you won't want to miss.